The grave sat at the edge of the valley, where the old wall used to be, before the wall fell, before the war that made it fall became the kind of war that nobody talked about anymore, because the people who'd fought it were all dead, and the people who came after them had learned slowly that some things are better left in the ground with the men who bled for them. Merritt Hoss had tended the Valley Cemetery for 11 years. He was 63 years old, had a bad hip from a fall off a loading scaffold in his 40s, and had spent most of his adult life finding ways not to think too hard about the kinds of questions that tended to make a man sit down in the middle of his work and stare at nothing for a long time. He was good at it. The work helped. There was always something that needed doing: a stone tilted by frost heave, a patch of crown vetch choking out the creeping thyme that the old groundskeeper before him had planted along the western fence. You could get from sunrise to sunset without thinking at all if you kept your hands busy enough. He was a man of small disciplines. The flask of tea he refilled from the same dented pot every morning at 5. The exact route he walked in the same order every day, east fence to west, north gate to south, section 1 through section 9 in order and then back again. The cemetery held 412 graves. He knew every one of them. Not the people, most of the people he had no way of knowing, but the stones. Their lean and their condition, and which ones needed attention, and which ones were solid and would take care of themselves for another few seasons. He had a relationship with the stones, the way a sailor has a relationship with a particular stretch of coast. He knew their moods. He first noticed the tracks on an April morning, 3 years into his tenure. They were in the soft ground behind Section 9, the oldest part of the cemetery, where the stones were so weathered that some of them had gone entirely smooth and blank, the names worn back into the rock as if the rock had decided to take them back. Whoever had made the tracks had come from the tree line to the north, walked in a line so straight it looked surveyed, stopped at a single grave in the back corner, and left the same way they'd come. The feet were bare. The toes were wide and the stride was long, and the depth of the impressions suggested a body that weighed considerably more than its foot size would indicate. Merritt stood over the tracks for a while. He had a particular way of standing when he was thinking that his daughter had once described as looking like he was trying to grow roots, and he did that now. He stood over the tracks and looked at them, and then he walked the line from the fence to the grave and back again, slowly, and then he stood some more. The tracks were not human. He had grown up in the border country, and he knew enough to say that with some certainty. The toe spread was too wide, and the arch was too pronounced, and the depth. He dug a finger into the earth beside the impression, and tested the resistance, and did the rough mathematics in his head. The depth said something over 200 pounds, maybe 250, pressing on feet that were not quite that large. He did not go to the administrators. He did not call the 2 constables in the nearest town, who would have come out, walked the same perimeter he'd walked, written something down in a notebook, looked at each other with the expression of people who had decided not to have an opinion about this, and left feeling they'd done their part. He did not tell his daughter, who called him every Sunday and worried about him living alone in the valley. He went and looked at the grave. The stone read, SGT, ALDRICPENN, 14th Border Company. The date of death was 41 years ago. There was no town of origin, no unit motto, no family inscription, all of which told a particular kind of story about the kind of man Aldrich Penn had been, or at least about the kind of paperwork that had followed him after he stopped being able to file any. Below the name and the dates, someone, not the stone carver, the chisel marks were different, newer, had added 3 words in a script Merritt didn't recognize. They weren't in the common tongue. They weren't in any tongue he knew. The letters were angular and deliberate, carved with something narrow and very sharp, and they went from right to left. He took a rubbing of them on a piece of paper from his pocket and drove into town and showed them to the woman at the archive office, who ran a translation service on the side. She looked at them for a long time. She turned the paper upside down and looked at it that way too. She held it up to the light from the window. She set it down again. "I don't know this," she said, "but I know what it resembles." "What does it resemble?" She set the paper down flat on the counter between them. "Orcish, high formal, not the trade pigeon, the court register, the kind they use for oaths, for declarations of debt and obligation." Merritt looked at the paper. "What's it say?" "I'd need a proper scholar for the exact translation. The court register is not something most translators work with. There's not much call for it, as you'd imagine." She tapped the paper. "But the root characters, the first glyph and the third, they're the ones you find at the head of a mourning declaration. This one here." She pointed at the first symbol. "In most of the known dialects, this means something like 'who is owed,' or 'the debt that stands.' It's the word you use before someone's name when they died for you. Not for your people generally, for you specifically." Merritt drove home along the valley road with the windows down, and the late afternoon light coming in at an angle across the fields, and he thought about what she'd said the whole way. He didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was afraid, but because the question had gotten into him and he couldn't shake it loose. 41 years ago, a border sergeant named Aldrich Penn had died in whatever the war had been, and somewhere in the world that had come after, an orc, probably more than one, given the foot size, but definitively not human, came back every spring and stood at his grave and left something written in a formal register of mourning that translated, roughly, to "the debt that stands." He thought about that for a long time in the dark of his small house at the edge of the cemetery, listening to the wind move through the trees to the north, and he decided he was going to be here when they came back. He waited all of April and into May, which in the valley meant cold mornings and mud that sucked at your boots, and a particular kind of gray sky that hung low over the tree line, and never quite became rain, and never quite became clear. He developed a habit of arriving before first light and sitting inside the equipment shed with the door cracked and a thermos of tea, and watching the northern fence line. He brought a blanket for his knees because the chill off the ground was the kind that got into the joints. He saw deer, a doe and 2 half-grown fawns that had been using the cemetery as a thoroughfare since before he'd arrived, and a young buck who had recently decided Section 3 was his territory and left evidence of this on 2 of the older stones, which Merritt had cleaned up without particular resentment. He saw a red fox that had denned somewhere near Section 4 and seemed to regard the cemetery as its personal hunting ground, moving through the stones at dusk and dawn with the proprietary ease of something that has decided it lives somewhere. He saw, once, a pair of hikers who had gotten turned around on the ridge trail and came stumbling through the back gate looking sheepish and cold, and he gave them directions and a cup of tea from his thermos, and watched them go without asking what they'd been doing on the fence line at 4 in the morning. On the morning of the 9th of May, he saw the orc. She came out of the tree line at the same point the tracks had indicated. There was a low place in the fence there, the rails worn down by something that had been crossing for years, the wood smooth and pale where the bark had been rubbed away, and she walked across the wet grass in a straight line toward Section 9, and she was small. That was the thing Merritt hadn't expected. He'd built up a picture in his head based on the tracks, on the weight implied by the depth of the impressions, on the general understanding any person of his generation had absorbed about orcs from the years of the war and the newspaper accounts he'd grown up with. The figure crossing the cemetery in the gray pre-dawn was not that. She was perhaps 12 years old, maybe 13, in the way orc ages mapped to human ones, which he knew was not a clean translation, but the proportions were right, the particular look of a person who had not yet grown into the fullness of what they were going to be. She was short for her kind, though still broader in the shoulder than most human adults. Her skin was the gray-green of deep river moss seen through clear water. Her hair was black and pulled back in a braid that had been dressed with something, some oil or wax, in the formal way he'd seen in the archive photographs of delegation ceremonies. She wore clothes that were too good for a child crossing a field in the dark, a dark coat with silver toggles, fitted trousers, boots that looked like they had been polished very recently and were rapidly acquiring a hem of mud as she walked. She carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, cradled against her side. She did not look toward the equipment shed. She walked with the particular quality of someone who had made this walk before and knew exactly where they were going, and was not interested in anything that was not the destination. She moved through the cemetery without hesitation, turning at the right stones, threading between the markers that were close together in Section 6, not because she could read the stones in the dark, but because she had the route memorized. Merritt stayed very still. She stopped at Aldrich Penn's grave. She stood there for a moment, and in the low light he couldn't see her face clearly, only the line of her, the set of her shoulders, the way she was absolutely not moving. She was standing at what he recognized, with a lurch somewhere in his chest, as attention. Not parade ground attention. She wasn't a soldier and she was a child. It was something older than that, the way a person stands when they are trying to give the whole of themselves to a moment they know is already over. When the thing you are honoring is not present and cannot receive the honor, and you do it anyway because the alternative is not doing it, and that is not acceptable. Then she unwrapped the oilcloth bundle. Inside was a flat stone and a folded piece of cloth and something that looked like a bundle of roots or dried herbs. She set the flat stone at the base of the grave marker with precise placement. She arranged the cloth on top of it with a precise, practiced care that spoke of having been taught the correct way to do this and having practiced it. She laid the bundle of roots across the cloth. Then she knelt in the mud without any apparent concern for the coat or the boots or anything else that was going to be ruined by kneeling in wet ground in good clothes, pressed both palms flat against the earth at the base of the stone, and was still. She stayed that way for a long time. Merritt watched her and felt the question getting heavier inside him. He was a practical man. He was the kind of man who had spent 11 years maintaining a place where the dead were kept, which required a particular relationship with the fact of death, not reverence exactly, not grief, but a steady and daily acknowledgement that the dead had been real people and that the ground they occupied had weight and deserved tending. He was not a sentimental man. He had learned not to be, because sentimentality in his line of work would swallow you whole. But watching a child, and she was a child, whatever else she was, kneel in the mud in the gray morning and press her hands into the earth above a grave that 41 years of spring had mostly been allowed to forget, he felt something shift in the machinery of his chest. Something move that had been stuck for a while. She rose. She cleaned the mud from her palms on a cloth she'd kept in her coat pocket, methodical and careful. She looked at the stone for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back across the wet grass toward the tree line the same way she'd come, straight and unhurrying, and she was already gone before she was actually gone. Merritt stayed in the equipment shed until she was well into the trees. Then he put down his thermos and went and knelt at the grave himself and looked at what she'd left. The flat stone was not local. The rock type was different, darker, almost purple-gray, very fine-grained, the kind of stone that came from the high country east of the passes, volcanic geology, the sort of material you'd have to carry a considerable distance. Something had been carved into its face. The same angular script as in the headstone. More of it this time, 3 lines of it. He took another rubbing. The cloth was silk. Orc woven, the pattern a tight geometric weave in black and silver that was clearly not decorative but encoded, the same way a military medal encodes information in its design for those who know how to read it. It cost more than he made in a month. He could tell that without knowing anything about Orc textile markets. It was the kind of cloth that said, "This is a serious thing, from serious people, given with serious intent." The roots were wrapped in a twist of dried grass and bound with a thread of what looked like human hair, long and dark. That stopped him for a moment. He looked at it for a long time in the growing light. He drove back to the archive woman. She looked at the rubbing for a long time and then sat down in her chair. "This is a dead song," she said. in the high formal register. Orcs use them at the graves of non-kin who died in their service. The grammar is archaic. You'd find it in texts from the Second Imperial period, maybe the Third. Nobody writes like this anymore. Nobody has for 100 years. It's the kind of language you'd use if you wanted the acknowledgement to be understood as absolute, permanent, not a courtesy, a binding declaration. She traced the first line with her finger without touching the paper. This first section is the name of the one who is owed, Aldrich Penn. Rendered phonetically, you can see they've approximated the sounds in their script. They've done it carefully. She moved to the second line. This second section is a declaration of lineage. It's the declarant naming themselves and their house. She stopped. What? Merritt said. She looked up at him. Her expression had changed. The name written here is Rin Korath Vas. The patronymic suffix, Vas, that's a royal house suffix, not minor nobility, not regional governance. It's the suffix of the ruling line of the Eastern Reach. Merritt sat down in the chair in front of her desk without being invited to. You're telling me the daughter of the Eastern Reach ruler is coming here every spring to leave offerings at the grave of a border sergeant? The granddaughter, if the age you're describing is right. The current matriarch of the Eastern Reach, Korath Vas, she would be in her late 50s now. If this is her granddaughter, she set the rubbing down. There were years of these, you said. You found the carved inscription already in the stone when you took your rubbing, so this has been going on for some time. At least since before I started here. That's 11 years. She was quiet for a moment, and he let her be quiet because she was thinking the same thing he was thinking, and they both needed a minute with it. The third section of the inscription is a promise. The debt song tradition, the way it works in the High Court Register, the declarant is swearing that the debt will be acknowledged annually until either the debt is paid or the line of the debtor ends. Royal oaths of this kind are binding in a way that goes beyond ceremony. They are recorded. They pass to the next generation, the way property passes. They don't break them. They can't, by their own law. She folded her hands on the desk. Sergeant Penn did something for the Eastern Reach, something significant enough that the royal line considers itself in debt to his memory. Something they haven't told anyone about, apparently, because I have been working with historical records in this region for 30 years, and I have never seen his name associated with the Reach in any way. Merritt drove home. He sat in the equipment shed in the dark and thought about what a border sergeant could have done 41 years ago in the years of the war. That would make the royal line of the Eastern Reach carve his name in court script and send their children across mountain passes every spring to kneel in the mud at his grave. He thought about the silk cloth and the roots bound with dark hair. He thought about a child who polished her boots and dressed her hair before crossing a fence in the dark to honor a man who had been dead for more than 4 times her own age. He thought about it for a long time, and then he thought about something else. She had been alone. Not escorted, not guarded. A child of the ruling line of the Eastern Reach, crossing into human territory alone, entering a human cemetery alone in the gray before sunrise, kneeling with her hands in the earth. Nobody had been there to see it except him, and he was beginning to understand that nobody was supposed to be. He did not try to approach her the second year. He was there. He was always there now on the 9th of May, give or take a day on either side, because he'd figured out that the date was consistent. But he stayed in the equipment shed and watched and let her have the space, because it was not his grief and not his ritual, and he was a man who understood in his bones that some things are not for the living to interrupt. She came the same way and left the same way and knelt the same way, and this time when she rose, she stood for a longer moment with her head bowed and one hand still touching the top of the grave marker, not holding it, just resting against it with the same light pressure you'd use to touch something breakable. And in that moment, Merritt could see her face in the growing light. She was crying. Not obviously. Not the way children cry when they are overwhelmed or frightened, the open-faced crying that asks for comfort. The way people cry when they are doing something they do not expect to stop having to do, when grief has become a practice rather than a crisis. 2 tracks down the gray-green of her face, very controlled and very still, and her jaw was set and her eyes were open, and she was not going to be defeated by this. She was just going to do it anyway, the way you do the necessary things regardless of how they feel. Merritt looked away. He looked at his hands on the thermos and he thought, Aldrich Penn, you have been dead 41 years and I'm only just learning what you did. And whoever did this has been learning it and then relearning it every spring for longer than I've been here. He refilled his tea and listened to her footsteps going away across the wet grass until he couldn't hear them anymore. In the 3rd year, he went to the Capitol on his own time and his own coin. He had been saving the rubbings and the notes he'd made, careful, precise notes in the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, dates and times and exact descriptions of what had been left at the grave each year, the small variations in the offerings, and he took these to the academic archive, which was a different institution than the town archive, staffed by people with more letters after their names and considerably less patience for the layperson. He found a scholar of border country languages on his 3rd day of looking. She was very old and very small, and she worked in a room full of stacked papers that looked like it had achieved its current state of organization over decades of deliberate intention. She looked at his rubbings for a very long time. "This is impeccably written," she said. "Whoever carved this, the hand is trained, court-educated. You don't get this kind of orthographic precision without years of formal instruction in the register. Can you translate it?" She could. She spent 2 hours on it, cross-referencing 3 different texts, making notes in a hand so small he couldn't read it from across the desk. When she was finished, she handed him a sheet of paper. The first line, Aldrich Penn who is owed. The second line, declared by Rin Koreth Vass of the line of the Eastern Reach, 3rd in descent from Koreth Vass the Elder. The third line, until the debt is paid or the line ends, this is acknowledged. We do not forget, we came back. Merritt read it 3 times. He folded it and put it in his pocket. The last phrase, he said, we came back, is that a standard part of these declarations? The scholar looked at him over the top of her glasses. No, the standard closing is this stands, or variations on that phrase. We came back is unusual. It implies that returning was in some way notable, that there was a reason they might not have come back, or a reason that coming back required something from them. She paused. It also implies that there is a specific coming back, a physical act, not just the maintenance of the debt in abstract, but a literal return to a literal place. I see, Merritt said. Where did you find this inscription? A cemetery, he said. It's my job. She looked at him for a long moment over the glasses. She was not a foolish woman. He could see her deciding not to ask the next question. Thank you, he said. This was very helpful. He drove home with the translation in his pocket and the weight of it had changed. It had gotten more specific. We came back. Not a declaration of a general intention, but a description of a particular thing that had already happened, a particular thing that had required something, required effort, required crossing something, required coming back to a place that had been left behind. He lay awake that night in the quiet of the house at the edge of the cemetery and thought, Penn, what did you do that made coming back necessary for them? What did you do that was so significant that 3 generations of the ruling line have crossed mountain passes in the dark to honor it? And then lying in the dark, and why did nobody record it? The year Merritt was 67. His daughter came to visit, and she was sharp-eyed in the way she'd always been, the product of a childhood spent watching her father for the small signs of what he was actually thinking versus what he said he was thinking. She was a historian by training, had worked in the Capitol archives before she'd moved to the coast, and she noticed the rubbings on his desk on the 3rd day of her visit and sat down with them without asking. He told her. He told her everything because she was his daughter, and because he had been carrying it for 4 years and it had grown heavy, and because she was possibly the most useful person he knew for the specific kind of problem he had, which was the problem of a historical record that should exist and didn't. She sat with it for a long time. She had a patience for sitting with incomplete information that he had always admired and never quite managed to acquire for himself. "Do you want me to look into Penn?" she said. "I've looked." "What did you find?" "Military record. Enlisted at 19. Rose to sergeant in the 14th Border Company within 5 years, which is faster than average. Killed in action in the 9th year of the Secession Wars. No family on record. He was an orphan, grew up in the state houses in the Eastern District. Buried here because this was the nearest certified military cemetery to the engagement site, which is listed in the record as," he checked his notebook, "the Kessevar Ridge. No medals, no commendations. No record of any action that would explain." He gestured at the rubbings spread across the desk. His daughter looked at them. She turned one of them over and back again. "The Secession Wars, 9th year." She was quiet for a moment in a particular way, the way she got when something had connected. "That's the year of the Kessevar Accord, the preliminary peace treaty, the one that almost didn't happen." "I know. It almost didn't happen because someone leaked the location of the human delegation to the Reach commanders." "Right. And the delegation was ambushed at the approach road, and 3 of the 4 human negotiators were killed, and by every account the accord should have collapsed, and a further 11 years of war should have followed, and by the casualty projections of the time." She paused. "You're looking at a very large number of people who didn't die because the accord held instead of collapsing." "But it held," Merritt said. "Because someone, the official record is extremely vague on this, and it's always seemed vague on purpose. Every historian who's looked at this period has noticed the gap. Someone got the surviving negotiator and the Reach liaison out, across the border, through territory that was actively hostile on both sides, in the immediate aftermath of the ambush, with both sides' forces moving." She looked at the rubbings. "The 14th Border Company. They were stationed at Kessevar Ridge." Merritt was very still. "The Reach liaison," his daughter said carefully. "The records describe her as a senior diplomatic official, middle-aged, with full authority to sign for the Reach. But that's the kind of language you use in official documents when you're trying not to say something. When the thing you're trying not to say is more important than the official record can comfortably contain." She looked at him. "If the Reach liaison had been someone whose death would have ended not just the accord, but any possibility of a future accord for a generation. Someone the ruling line would consider a debt worth keeping across 40 years. "Across generations," she said. "Yes." They sat together in the quiet of the equipment shed, with the rubbings between them and the sound of the wind in the trees outside. The fox from Section 4 went past the window, unhurried, carrying something. "He was an orphan from the state houses," Merritt said. "No commendations, no record of anything remarkable. Just a sergeant of the 14th Border Company who ended up in the right place at the right moment, and did something that nobody recorded, and then died before he could record it himself. And the only people who know what he did," his daughter said, "came back every year to acknowledge it because by their law and their custom they couldn't not." Merritt looked at the rubbings. "We came back. The history was written without him in it," he said. "Yes, because the history needed to be written a particular way for the peace to hold. Because if the account had come out, a single sergeant, an ambush, a liaison who wasn't who the record said she was, it would have raised questions about who had leaked the location of the delegation. It would have required an accounting of how the ambush happened. It would have destabilized what was still very fragile." His daughter folded her hands on the desk the same way the archive woman had. The piece was more important than the record. "But someone knew." "Yes, someone knew. And they have been coming back every spring for 41 years to say so. The 9th of May, the year Merritt was 68. He brought 2 cups and his thermos, and he stood outside the equipment shed when she came across the field, and he waited until she had done the thing she always did: the flat stone, the cloth, the roots, the kneeling, the stillness. And when she rose and turned to go, he was standing at the far edge of Section 9 with his hands very visible and the 2 cups in one of them, and he did not move. She saw him. She went very still in the way that was not stillness but readiness, the particular quality of a body that has just catalogued several possible responses and is deciding between them, and he saw it and stayed exactly where he was and looked at the ground between them. Not at her. Not submission, but patience. The gesture of someone who has no claim and knows it. A long moment. Then she walked toward him. She had grown. She was not a child anymore. She was somewhere in her middle years by Orc reckoning, which he understood mapped to something like a human's early 20s, though the development was different and he was working from incomplete knowledge and was aware of working from incomplete knowledge. She was taller than him now, broader through the shoulders, and the coat was a different coat but the same quality, and she moved with the bearing that comes with growing up, knowing that rooms arrange themselves around you when you enter them, not arrogance, but a settled awareness of weight. She stopped 3 paces from him and looked at the cups. "Tea," he said. "I have it without anything in it. I didn't know what you'd want." She looked at the cups for a long moment. Something moved in her face that he couldn't quite read, the particular unreadability of a face trained by years of court formality to express exactly what it intended and nothing beyond. Then she reached out and took one of the cups. They stood at the edge of Section 9 in the gray morning and drank tea over the grave of Aldrich Penn, and did not speak for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence 2 people share when they have both been keeping the same secret from different sides, and have just now met in the middle of it, and are each waiting for the other to speak first, and have both, separately, decided not to rush. "You know," she said finally. Her common tongue was precise and formal and slightly accented, the kind of fluency that comes from study rather than immersion, every word placed with deliberate care. "Some of it," Merritt said. "Enough." She looked at the stone. The morning light had come in across the tree line, and the stones of Section 9 were gold. "He carried my grandmother across the Kesavar Narrows," she said. "She was 17 years old. She was the junior liaison, not the senior." The documents reversed her position, because if the Eastern commanders had known who she actually was, they would have sent twice as many men to the ambush. She paused, the even pace of someone reciting something that has been recited many times, the worn smoothness of a story that has been kept exactly right through repetition. He knew who she was. From the moment he found her in the aftermath of the ambush, he recognized her. He knew the whole time, through every hour of those 8 miles. He carried her across the Narrows in the dark, him and 2 men from his company, and he wouldn't let her stop moving, and when she told him she couldn't go on. She stopped, the jaw set, the way it had set when she was 12 years old and crying in the gray morning, the same fierce, controlled expression. He said, "You can go on, you just think you can't. Those are different things." Merritt looked at his cup. The tea had gone cool. He drank it anyway. "He died at the border crossing," she said. "They were 3 men and they were already spent, and there were 6 of the Eastern Patrol waiting. He told the other 2 to go with her. My grandmother said he said it the same way he said everything, like it was just the next obvious step. Like the calculation was simple, and he'd already done it, and the answer was clear. Like he didn't need them to agree with him, or thank him, or acknowledge that he'd just told them to leave him behind." She was quiet for a moment. She made it home, the accord held. She became what she became, which was the thing the Eastern commanders had been trying to prevent her from becoming. A pause. She came here herself for 22 years, every spring the same date, the same route. She taught my mother the words. She taught her the formal register for the debt song, hired a scholar for it, had my mother practice the script. My mother came for 12 years. Then my mother died and I was the one who knew the words. How old were you? Merritt said. When you first came. 11. He looked at the grave. 11 years old. Crossing the mountain passes, coming into human territory alone, kneeling in the mud before sunrise. Because her grandmother had told her what it meant and her mother had taught her the words, and now it was her turn, and she was 11 years old and she was the line. She told you what he said, Merritt said. Your grandmother, the thing he said to her at the crossing. She told me everything. The princess looked at the stone. We have a tradition in the Reach of preserving the exact words of significant moments, not paraphrasing the exact words, practiced and memorized and passed down. Because in the high court language there is no exact equivalent for the concept of close enough when it comes to what was said. What was said is what was said. A pause. She remembered every word he said to her from the moment he found her in the wreckage of the ambush until the moment he told the others to go. She made me memorize them. I made my son memorize them. Merritt looked at her. He will come here someday, she said, when I cannot. The sun had fully cleared the tree line now. Section 9 had gone from gray to gold, the old smoothed stones warm in the early light. Nobody knows he's here, Merritt said. The history books. I know. She said it without particular bitterness, the flatness of a fact that has been lived with long enough to lose its edge. The accord needed to be seen as having succeeded through the proper channels, through the work of the senior officials. The story needed to be clean. If the account had come out, a single sergeant, an ambush, a 17-year-old girl, the junior liaison on paper but not in fact, it would have raised questions about who had leaked the location of the delegation, about the security of the summit process. It would have required accountability from powerful people who were still powerful and who had made the peace possible and who could not be exposed without fracturing what the peace had built. She paused. My grandmother understood this. She consented to the silence because she believed the peace was worth more than the record, but she never consented to forgetting. Another pause. She was very specific about that, the difference. There is a difference, Merritt said. They stood a little longer. The fox from Section 4 appeared at the far end of the cemetery, saw them, and sat down on a low stone to consider whether they were a threat worth worrying about. Decided they weren't. Went on about its mourning. You've been watching, the princess said. It was not a question. Watching, he said, not intruding. She considered that. You've been maintaining the stone. The last 3 years someone has been repairing the mortar at the base. The frost heave gets to these older markers. It does. Thank you. Merritt thought about how to say the next thing. He had been thinking about it for 4 years, and he still wasn't sure he had it right. There's a gap in the record, he said. Not in my record in the formal archive. The military record for the 14th Border Company, 9th year of the Cessation Wars, has a section that's been redacted, sealed. It can be unsealed through a formal petition process. The princess looked at him steadily. I don't have standing to file that petition, he said. I'm a groundskeeper, but if someone wanted to initiate the process for the formal recognition of an unrecorded act of service in the Cessation Wars, the process is slow. It takes years. It requires corroborating documentation from both sides of the relevant engagement. It requires testimony from parties with standing to give it. He looked at the grave. But at the end of it there'd be a record, a real one. His name in the right place with the right account attached to it. Not the public history wouldn't change, but the archive record, available to anyone who looked 100 years from now. He could feel her looking at him. He was an orphan, he said. There's nobody to file on his behalf. There's no family who can petition, and even if there were, they'd need a corroborating account from the other side of the border, she said quietly. Written testimony, formal attestation, from someone with the authority to give it. Yes. The silence stretched out over Section 9 in the morning light. A bird was working its way through the same phrase in the trees over and over, the way birds do when they've found something they like and see no reason to stop. "I have never put my grandmother's account in writing," the princess said. "She asked me not to. She believed the silence still served a purpose." A pause. "She died 14 years ago. I have been thinking since then about whether she was right about that, and about whether what was true then is still true now." "I don't know if she was right," Marit said. "I just know what I see when I come here every morning. I see 412 graves, and most of them have something: family names, unit histories, photographs on the stone, people who are remembered. And then there's that one." He looked at the grave. "And I know more about what he did than anyone else alive. But I can't do anything with it except keep his stone clean and his grass cut, and his mortar repaired, and watch the frost line in winter." The princess looked at the grave for a long time. "5 years," she said. "Maybe 10. I will be taking on a different role in 4 years," she said. "There are things that will be more difficult after that transition, things that require a kind of informality, a willingness to move through the world without observers that the role won't allow." She looked at Marit. "But there are also things that become possible: archival access on our side of the border, the authority to make formal attestations that carry the weight of the crown." A pause. "Both things at once." "That's how it usually works," Marit said. Yes, she was quiet. Then she set the empty cup down on the flat stone at the base of the grave marker, very gently, and straightened. "I will need to think about this. I know. There are people who would prefer the record stays sealed. On both sides. The Kesavar Accord has been precedent for 4 treaties since. If the original account were to surface, even quietly, even through archival channels, there are people who would want to shape the narrative." "I know that too. You've thought about this for some time." 4 years, he said. "I've had time to think." She looked at him for a moment with the quality of assessment, the careful reading of a person across from you that comes with years of having to make accurate judgments about people quickly. Then something shifted slightly in her expression. "My grandmother told me something else he said," she said, "at the crossing, when she knew, when it was clear that there was not going to be enough of him left to go with them." She paused. "She said he was laughing. She couldn't believe it. She said it wasn't the laugh of someone who didn't understand what was happening. He understood exactly. It was the laugh of someone who finds the whole situation funny in a specific way. And she had just enough time, just enough distance to ask him, why. And he said..." She stopped, the jaw set again, the controlled stillness. "He said, because I'm an orphan from the state houses, and somehow I ended up here, at the border of everything, with the most important person in it. And that's funny. That's genuinely funny." The cemetery was warm now. Section 9 had gone from gold to ordinary daylight, the stones just stones in the morning, each one a name and a date, and the compressed summary of a life. "He sounds like someone worth remembering," Marit said. "He saved the world," she said, "and he thought it was funny." They drank tea together for 3 more years, always on the 9th of May, always in Section 9, always at the grave with the angular script, and the offerings on the flat stone that Marit had stopped moving, because it had been there long enough now that it seemed like it had always been there. She filed the petition in the 4th year. He was not privy to the details of how she filed it, or through what channels, or what it cost her in the kind of political currency that people like her traded in. But he knew she had done it because he received a formal letter from the Capitol Archive Office in the fall of that year, notifying him that a petition had been received requesting the unsealing of records pertaining to the 9th year, 14th Border Company, and that he had been named as a corroborating witness of record and would be contacted for testimony. He was contacted in the spring. A quiet, careful archivist arrived at the cemetery with a sealed folder and a formal expression and a voice recorder, and asked him, with precision and patience, to describe everything he had observed and when and how. He described it. He gave them the rubbings, the translations, 11 years of observation notes in the small notebook. He gave them the name of the scholar in the capital who had done the formal translation. He described the offerings in exact detail. The flat stone, the silk cloth, the roots and the dark hair, the angular script added to the original inscription. The archivist left with everything. He wrote her name in his notebook. He was 72 when the formal notification arrived. Not a public announcement. The archivist had been clear that this would not be a public announcement. In the archive index under the Cessation Wars, 9th year, 14th Border Company, there was a new entry. Cross-reference to the Kosovar Accord. Cross-reference to the diplomatic record of the Eastern Reach. 3 paragraphs plain language, no passive voice. His daughter called him the night the notification arrived and read it to him over the phone. The name at the top was Aldrich Penn. Below the name were the facts, what he had done and where and what it had cost him and what it had made possible, written in the place where people who were looking for this kind of thing would find it. Not today. Today the people who'd want to control the story were still alive and still careful. But in 100 years or 200, when the politics had long since settled and the treaties had been replaced by other treaties, and what mattered was only the true account of what had actually happened. His daughter said, "Dad." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you all right?" He thought about it for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I think so." She said, "He was an orphan. He wasn't going to have anyone to do this for him." No, Merritt said, he wasn't. Merritt was 75 when the Orc princess came for what turned out to be the last time she would come alone, though he did not know that was the last time, and she did not say so directly. She came in the evening instead of the morning, which was different. The light was low and orange, and the shadows were long across Section 9, and she came without the coat and without the formal dress, and she looked, for the first time since Merritt had known her, like someone who was very tired in the specific way that has nothing to do with sleep. She had a different kind of bearing now. He had watched her change over the years. The way the role she'd inherited had settled into her body like weight settling into a foundation. The way she moved through the world with the particular gravity of someone who is always aware that their decisions have consequences that extend very far beyond themselves. It was not a bad thing. It was the look of someone who takes their work seriously and always has. But it was different from the child crossing the fence in the dark, and he thought, the child was carrying it because she'd been taught to, and the woman is carrying it because she's decided to, and those are different things. She sat down on the ground in front of the grave, not kneeling, not the formal position. Just sat in the grass with her long legs folded and her back against the adjacent stone and her coat on the grass beside her, and it was the most informal thing he had ever seen her do in this place. He sat down too, on the other side of the grave, on the flat stone she'd brought 11 years ago that had been there long enough now to look native. "It's done," she said. "I know. Did you read the entry?" "My daughter read it to me." He paused. "She cried." The princess looked at the grave in the evening light. "It's not enough." "No," he said, "it isn't. It's what's possible." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. A nightjar was warming up somewhere in the trees to the north, the stuttering call of it carrying in the still evening. "My grandmother used to say that there are debts that can't be paid," she said. "That the point of acknowledging them is not to reach zero. The point is that you keep showing up, that the showing up is the payment. That what you're really paying is the acknowledgement itself. That it happened, that it was real, that it deserves to be remembered by someone who could have forgotten it and chose not to." Merritt thought about 11 years of watching, and then 7 years of tea in the morning, and the rubbings in his coat pocket, and the drive to the Capitol Archive and the scholar in the cluttered room, and the translation on the sheet of paper that he still had, folded, in the notebook. "She's right," he said. The evening deepened over Section 9. The nightjar had found its rhythm. The fox from Section 4, or perhaps the fox's offspring from Section 4, it was hard to be certain at this point, was somewhere at the back of the cemetery, invisible and occupied. "I won't be able to come every year," she said. "After the full transition, the observers, the protocol, I can't cross a border fence in the dark anymore." A pause. "I'll send someone, my son. He knows the words. He's been practicing the route." "That's all right. It won't be the same." "No, but it'll be enough." She turned the lacquered cup in her hands, the geometric pattern of her house catching the last of the orange light. "You've been here a long time," she said. 14 years now. Do you ever think about leaving?" Merritt looked at the stones in the low light. All the names he knew by their stones, if not by their lives. The frost heave he managed every spring. The crown vetch he fought every summer. The fox and the deer, and the hikers who got lost on the ridge, and came through the back gate looking for someone to tell them where they were. "No," he said. She nodded. She set the cup down on the flat stone. She rose and she stood at the grave for one last long moment in the way she had always stood, the full attention, the absolute stillness, the quality of giving the whole of yourself to something, and then she turned. "He was right, you know," she said. She was looking at the stone, not at Merritt. "That it was funny, that it is funny, the whole shape of it. An orphan from the state houses and a girl from the reach, and an accord that held and a peace that held, and all of it balanced on 8 miles of dark narrows, and a man who found that funny." She paused. "I used to think that was irreverent when I was young. I thought, how can you find it funny? And now I understand what he meant." "What did he mean?" She looked at the stone one more time. The light was nearly gone now. The angular script on the flat stone was invisible in the shadow, but it was there. "He meant that the world is very large, and the things that matter are very small, and the chances of any one person being in the right place at the right moment to do the right thing are very long, and when it happens anyway, when you find yourself there, against all the odds, at the place where it matters, what else can you do but laugh?" She walked back across the field in the dark. Merritt sat for a long time after she was gone. The nightjar was still at it. The light had finished its leaving, and the sky was full dark in the east and deep blue in the west. That brief window of both at once before it all goes the same color. In the distance, beyond the fence line, the high country was a dark shape against the sky. The same country where 41 years ago a young man from the state houses had carried something across the dark narrows, and had thought it was funny, and had been right, and had died before he could tell anyone. But someone had been there. Someone had been paying attention. And they had come back. Merritt stood. He picked up both cups. He stood at the grave for a moment in the dark, the stone invisible now but present, the flat stone at its base invisible but there with its angular script, the debt that stands. "All right, Sergeant Penn," he said. "I'll see you tomorrow." He walked back across the grass toward the equipment shed, the square of light at the edge of the cemetery, and behind him the stones of Section 9 stood in the quiet dark, and the writing that nobody could see said, "We came back." They had. They would. It was enough.